There comes a moment in life when you realize something unsettling. Not everyone who treats you coldly is reacting to something you did. You walk into a room with neutral intentions, maybe even goodwill, and yet you sense resistance. Short answers, tight smiles, a distance that wasn't there before, or perhaps was always there, hidden just well enough for you to ignore. The mind immediately looks for explanations. Did I say something wrong? Did I offend them? Did I fail some invisible test? Stoicism begins precisely at this moment, when the mind is tempted to turn outward for blame or inward for self-punishment, and instead is invited to pause. The Stoics understood a hard truth most people spend their lives avoiding. Other people's emotions are rarely about you. They are about what is stirred inside them when you appear. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself again and again that human beings act from their own judgments, fears, and desires, not from objective reality. When someone dislikes you without a clear cause, it is often because your presence touches something unresolved in them. This does not make them evil. It makes them human, and it does not make you responsible. One of the most common roots of unexplained dislike is envy, quiet and unspoken. Envy does not always look like open hostility. More often it appears as withdrawal, subtle criticism, or a cool indifference that feels personal but is never directly addressed. When someone sees in you a quality they wish they had but believe they cannot attain, your existence becomes uncomfortable. Your success, your confidence, even your calmness becomes a mirror reflecting their dissatisfaction. Instead of looking inward, they turn outward. Resentment is easier than self-examination. Stoicism teaches that envy belongs entirely to the one who feels it. You cannot cure it, negotiate with it, or earn your way out of it. Trying to shrink yourself to make others comfortable only teaches them that your value is negotiable. Marcus Aurelius warned against this kind of surrender. He wrote that you should never abandon your own character to escape the judgment of others. Your task is not to be liked, but to be steady. Another source of silent dislike lies in misunderstanding, a tone misread, a pause interpreted as arrogance, a boundary mistaken for rejection. Most people do not ask for clarity, they assume, and assumptions, once formed, harden quickly into narratives. In their version of events, you become distant, unfriendly, dismissive, or proud, even if none of that was ever your intention. Over time, these stories replace reality. You are no longer reacting to the person in front of you. You are reacting to the character they have invented in their mind. Epictetus warned that we suffer not from events themselves, but from the judgments we attach to them. This applies both ways. Others judge you through the lens of their own experiences, insecurities, and expectations. Their dislike may be sincere, but sincerity does not make it accurate. Stoicism does not demand that you correct every false impression. It teaches discernment. Ask yourself one question: is this within my control? If it is not, release it. Peace begins where futile effort ends. Differences in values also create invisible friction. You may value discipline where another values comfort. You may prioritize honesty where another prefers harmony at any cost. You may live quietly while others measure worth through attention and approval. These differences do not require conflict, but they often provoke it. When someone treats their values as universal truths, anyone who lives differently becomes a challenge to their identity. Dislike grows not because you attack them, but because you exist as proof that another way is possible. The Stoics were deeply tolerant of difference, not because they believed all values were equal, but because they understood that each person is shaped by circumstances beyond their choosing. You are not obligated to align your life with another person's expectations to earn their approval. Doing so would place your inner stability in hands that will never hold it gently. Perhaps the most important Stoic insight at this stage is this: being disliked is not a signal that you must change. It is a signal that you must observe. Observe your own reactions. Observe the urge to explain yourself. Observe the temptation to chase approval. Every one of these impulses reveals something about where you are still attached. Freedom begins when you stop asking why they dislike you and start asking why their dislike unsettles you. A well-governed mind does not seek universal acceptance. It seeks alignment with reason and character. Marcus Aurelius wrote that if you live rightly, those who understand will respect you, and those who do not were never your audience. This is not arrogance, it is clarity. You were not placed in this world to be liked by everyone you meet. You were placed here to act with integrity, restraint, and purpose. In the next part, we will go deeper into the psychological mechanisms that turn insecurity into hostility and how projection quietly transforms someone's inner conflict into outward dislike. Understanding this will not make you bitter, it will make you calm. And calm, once established, is unshakable. There is a subtle shift that happens when dislike moves from confusion to clarity. At first, you wonder what you did wrong. Then, slowly, you begin to notice a pattern. The tension does not arise from your actions, but from their reactions. This is where Stoic philosophy offers one of its most liberating insights. Much of the hostility directed toward you is not about you at all. It is projection. Projection occurs when people displace emotions they cannot face within themselves and attach them to someone else. Insecurity, regret, fear of failure, and unresolved shame do not disappear simply because they are ignored. They seek expression. And often, the easiest outlet is another person who unintentionally triggers those buried feelings. You become the screen onto which their inner turmoil is projected. Seneca understood this deeply. He observed that disturbed minds disturb others. A person at peace rarely goes looking for enemies. When someone reacts to you with disproportionate dislike, sarcasm, or resentment, it is often because your presence awakens something they have been trying not to see. Your confidence may remind them of their hesitation. Your discipline may highlight their lack of control. Your calm may expose their chaos. None of this is conscious, but it is powerful. This is why some people seem threatened by you, even when you are not competing with them. You may not be trying to stand out, but your very way of being becomes a comparison they did not choose. And comparison, when filtered through insecurity, almost always turns into hostility. Rather than asking themselves difficult questions, they externalize the discomfort. It becomes easier to dislike you than to confront themselves. Stoicism teaches you not to absorb this projection. Epictetus was clear. If someone speaks ill of you, remember that they are speaking from their own impressions. Those impressions do not define you. They reveal them. The moment you internalize their hostility, you allow their unresolved struggles to enter your inner world. And that is where Stoics draw the line. Another powerful driver of resentment is the need for validation. Many people move through life dependent on recognition, approval, and reassurance. When they feel unseen or underappreciated, bitterness begins to grow. If you receive recognition they believe should belong to them, or if you seem content without external validation, it can trigger a sense of injustice. They tell themselves a story where you are undeserving and they are overlooked. Hatred becomes a way to rebalance the scales in their mind. Marcus Aurelius warned against craving applause precisely because it entangles your peace with the opinions of others. But the same principle applies in reverse. Those who depend on recognition are often deeply wounded when it is absent. They may not attack openly, but their resentment leaks out through distance, coldness, or quiet opposition. Again, this is not a reflection of your worth. It is a reflection of their dependency. There is also the factor of emotional immaturity. Some people lack the capacity for empathy, nuance, or self-reflection. They interpret the world in rigid terms, friend or enemy, right or wrong, with me or against me. In such a framework, neutrality feels like rejection, independence feels like arrogance, boundaries feel like hostility. If you do not play the role they expect, They assume intent where there is none. Stoicism does not ask you to correct these people, it asks you to see them clearly, to understand that not everyone has the tools to interpret reality accurately. And once you see that, you stop trying to earn understanding from those who are not equipped to give it. You conserve your energy for what is within your control, your conduct, your judgment, your inner order. Competition and rivalry further intensify these dynamics. When someone frames life as a zero-sum game, your success feels like their loss. Even if you are not competing, they are. And in their mind, you become an obstacle. Stoic wisdom dismantles this illusion. Another person's growth does not diminish yours. Another person's path does not block your own. But those trapped in rivalry cannot see abundance, they see threat. The Stoic response is not confrontation, nor withdrawal in bitterness. It is steadiness. You do not need to explain yourself to someone projecting onto you. You do not need to defend your character against accusations born of insecurity. Marcus Aurelius advised that the best revenge is not to be like the one who wrongs you. By remaining grounded, you deny their projection a place to land. As you begin to understand these mechanisms, something shifts. You stop taking unexplained dislike personally. You stop replaying interactions in your mind, searching for errors. You replace confusion with comprehension. And comprehension leads to peace. Not because others change, but because you no longer carry what was never yours to hold. In the next part, we will examine how gossip, rumor, and social narratives amplify resentment, and how Stoicism teaches you to protect your reputation without chasing it. This is where inner strength becomes visible restraint. At some point, dislike stops being personal and starts becoming collective. You notice the shift when people who barely know you seem to have already decided who you are. Their tone is cautious, their distance feels rehearsed. You sense that a story is circulating, one you were never invited to tell. This is the quiet power of rumor and misunderstanding, and it is one of the most difficult challenges to face without losing your balance. Gossip does not require truth to spread. It only requires plausibility. A half-formed impression, repeated enough times, becomes accepted reality. Stoics understood this danger well. Reputation, they knew, lives in the minds of others, and the minds of others are not governed by reason alone. They are shaped by fear, bias, and the desire to belong. When a narrative about you fits what people already suspect or fear, they accept it without question. Misunderstandings are often the seed. A moment taken out of context, a decision misunderstood, silence interpreted as indifference. Over time, these fragments are stitched together into a story that no longer resembles the truth. You become reduced to a label: difficult, cold, arrogant, unreliable. And once a label is applied, everything you do is filtered through it. Neutral actions are reinterpreted as proof. Kindness is seen as manipulation. Boundaries are framed as hostility. Marcus Aurelius warned against living for reputation because it places your peace in the hands of those who do not know you. He reminded himself that even the greatest figures in history were misunderstood, misrepresented, and judged unfairly. If this is true of emperors and philosophers, how could it not be true of ordinary lives? Expecting to be seen clearly by everyone is an unreasonable demand. And Stoicism begins by releasing unreasonable demands. The instinctive reaction to rumor is defense, to explain, to correct, to chase the story and set the record straight. Sometimes clarification is necessary, especially when practical consequences are at stake. But Stoic discipline asks a deeper question. Will this effort restore truth, or will it entangle you further in a narrative you cannot control? Often, the more you chase gossip, the more oxygen you give it. Silence, when chosen deliberately, can be stronger than rebuttal. Seneca wrote that false praise and false blame come from the same source: ignorance. To argue endlessly with ignorance is to become trapped by it. This does not mean passivity. It means choosing your ground carefully. Your character is revealed over time, not through counter-arguments, but through consistency. People who observe you closely will notice the gap between rumor and reality. Those who prefer the story were never interested in the truth to begin with. Another layer of misunderstanding arises from value differences. People interpret behavior through their own standards. If you value restraint, they may see coldness. If you value independence, they may see pride. If you value honesty, they may see confrontation. These misreadings are not malice, they are limitation. Expecting others to interpret you accurately without sharing your framework is unrealistic. Stoicism teaches acceptance of this limitation without resentment. What matters is not correcting every false belief, but remaining aligned with your principles. Marcus Aurelius advised that if something is not right, do not do it, and if it is not true, do not say it. He did not add an exception for reputation management. When your actions are steady and your values clear, your life becomes your answer. Not everyone will listen. That is not a failure, it is a boundary. There is also the danger of internalizing the story. When enough people treat you according to a false narrative, you begin to question yourself. You replay conversations, you soften your edges, you hesitate to act freely. This is where Stoicism becomes essential. Your self-image must be rooted in reason, not reflection. You are not who they say you are. You are who you repeatedly choose to be. The Stoic does not ignore reality, but they refuse to be shaped by distortion. They understand that rumors rise and fall, opinions shift, and narratives dissolve over time. What remains is character, and character, once formed, does not require defense. It requires maintenance. In the next part, we will explore how social expectations and value conflicts intensify dislike, and how Stoic boundaries protect you from being reshaped by other people's demands. This is where inner freedom becomes visible. Not all dislike is born from envy or rumor. Sometimes it comes from something quieter and more unsettling to others. You do not fit the mold they expect you to fit. You make choices that challenge the invisible rules people live by without ever questioning. And when those rules are challenged, discomfort quickly turns into judgment. Social expectations operate like unspoken contracts. They dictate how a person should behave, what success should look like, what paths are considered acceptable. Most people follow these expectations not because they have examined them, but because conformity offers safety. Belonging feels easier than thinking. When you step outside those boundaries, even calmly and without confrontation, you become a reminder that other options exist. And that reminder can feel threatening. You may choose a career path that prioritizes meaning over status. You may refuse to engage in performative busyness. You may speak less, decline more, or live with fewer external markers of success. To someone deeply invested in the social script, your choices feel like criticism, even when none is intended. They interpret your difference as judgment, and rather than question the script, they question you. Stoicism addresses this directly by separating values from approval. Marcus Aurelius wrote that if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. Social disapproval only wounds when we agree with the judgment behind it. When you know why you live as you do, outside opinions lose their authority. Value conflicts often masquerade as personal dislike. Someone who values constant social affirmation may feel uneasy around your self-sufficiency. Someone who defines worth through comparison may resent your lack of competitiveness. Someone who avoids introspection may feel exposed by your calm. None of this requires you to be wrong, nor does it require them to be malicious. It simply reveals incompatibility. The mistake many people make is trying to soften themselves to reduce friction. They dilute their values, explain their choices excessively, or seek permission to live differently. Stoicism rejects this impulse. Epictetus taught that if you wish to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid by the ignorant. He was not advocating arrogance, but independence. A life directed by external validation is not a life. It is a performance. This does not mean becoming rigid or dismissive of others. Stoic discipline is not about superiority. It is about alignment. You respect others' right to live by their values without surrendering your own. You listen without adopting. You engage without conforming. You allow discomfort to exist without rushing to resolve it. Social pressure intensifies when expectations are collective. Families, workplaces, and communities often enforce norms subtly. Questions framed as concern, advice disguised as care, suggestions repeated until they feel like obligations. When you resist, the reaction can escalate from confusion to resentment. You are no longer just different, you are difficult. Here is where boundaries become essential. A boundary is not an argument, it is not a justification, it is a quiet line you do not cross. Stoicism teaches that boundaries protect inner order. You do not need others to agree with your choices. You only need to act in accordance with reason and virtue. Everything else is noise. Dislike rooted in social expectation often fades with time. People either adjust to your consistency or distance themselves. Both outcomes are acceptable. What matters is that you do not abandon yourself in the process. The Stoic understands that harmony achieved through self-betrayal is not harmony at all. There is also freedom in recognizing that not everyone is meant to understand you. Understanding requires shared premises. Without them, explanation becomes futile. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that people act according to what seems right to them. Your task is not to correct their worldview, but to live rightly within your own. When you stop trying to fit expectations that do not align with your values, something shifts. The people who resented your difference lose their leverage. Their judgment no longer dictates your behavior, and the people who value authenticity over conformity begin to see you more clearly. Respect replaces approval. Quiet alignment replaces forced belonging. In the next part, we will examine one of the deepest sources of resentment, the lack of recognition and the hidden hunger for validation, and how Stoic self-sufficiency dissolves its power over you. One of the most overlooked sources of hostility is not hatred, envy, or rivalry, but something far more fragile, the pain of not being seen. Many people carry a quiet expectation that their efforts, sacrifices, or talents should be recognized. When that recognition does not come, disappointment hardens into resentment. And when resentment has nowhere to go, it often attaches itself to the nearest person who seems to be receiving what they believe they deserve. This is why someone may dislike you without ever having a real conflict with you. Your presence becomes a reminder of what they feel deprived of. Not because you wronged them, but because you represent acknowledgement they crave but do not receive. Recognition, in this sense, is not about praise, it is about validation. The feeling that one's existence, contribution, or struggle matters. Stoicism approaches this with radical clarity. The Stoics understood that the desire for external validation is endless. There will always be someone more praised, more visible, more celebrated. If your sense of worth depends on recognition, peace becomes impossible. Marcus Aurelius warned against this trap, reminding himself that it is meaningless to seek applause from people who do not even agree among themselves what is worthy of praise. When someone feels overlooked, they often externalize the pain. Instead of asking why recognition matters so deeply to them, they look outward for someone to blame. This is how resentment is born. They may convince themselves that you are favored unfairly, that your success is exaggerated, or that your character is flawed. These stories soothe the discomfort of feeling invisible. The danger here is subtle. If you internalize this hostility, you may begin to shrink yourself. You may downplay your achievements, silence your confidence, or carry guilt for being visible. Stoicism rejects this completely. You are not responsible for managing other people's unmet needs for validation. That burden belongs to them. The Stoic solution is not indifference, but independence. Epictetus taught that if you want to be free, do not desire things that depend on others. Recognition depends entirely on others. Therefore, tying your worth to it is voluntary enslavement. When you detach your sense of value from applause, resentment loses its grip on both sides. This does not mean ignoring appreciation when it comes. Gratitude is welcome, but it must be received lightly, not clutched desperately. The Stoic trains himself to measure his life by internal standards. Did I act with integrity, reason, and restraint? Did I do what was right, not what was noticed? Interestingly, when you stop seeking recognition, you often receive more genuine respect. People sense when someone is not performing for approval. That steadiness is rare. It contrasts sharply with those who constantly seek affirmation and react bitterly when it is withheld. For those who resent you because they feel unseen, compassion is appropriate, but distance may be necessary. You can understand their pain without absorbing it. You can remain fair without becoming smaller. Stoicism teaches balance, not self-sacrifice for the comfort of others' egos. There is also a lesson inward. If you notice resentment growing in yourself toward others, ask whether you are starving for recognition. Often, resentment is a signal pointing inward, not outward. It reveals unmet expectations you may not have consciously acknowledged. The Stoic response is honest self-examination, not self-blame, but clarity. If you need validation, admit it to yourself, then release it. Replace it with standards you control. This shift dissolves bitterness at its root. In the end, recognition is fleeting. Today's praise becomes tomorrow's silence, but character endures. A life built on internal alignment does not rise or fall with attention. And when you no longer need to be seen, you become unshakable in the face of those who resent you for being visible. In the final part, we will bring all these threads together and examine how to live peacefully amid misunderstanding, resentment, and judgment, without becoming hardened or withdrawn. At this point, one truth should be clear. When people dislike you without a clear reason, the cause is rarely you. More often, it is a reflection of what is unresolved within them. Envy, misunderstanding, insecurity, unmet expectations, hunger for recognition, rivalry, rigid values, gossip, or emotional blindness. These forces shape human behavior far more than most people are willing to admit. Stoicism does not deny this reality. It simply refuses to be ruled by it. The final lesson is not about changing how others feel toward you. That goal is both exhausting and impossible. The Stoic aim is freedom. Freedom from the need to be liked, approved of, understood, or validated by everyone. Freedom from internal turmoil when faced with judgment or hostility. Freedom to live according to reason and character, regardless of how others respond. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself repeatedly that other people's opinions are among the things not granted to us to control. They are external events. And to give external events authority over your inner life is to surrender your peace voluntarily. The Stoic does not harden himself against others, but he does not hand them the keys to his mind either. This is where boundaries become essential, not loud boundaries, not dramatic confrontations, but quiet, firm limits. You do not need to explain yourself endlessly. You do not need to justify your choices to those committed to misunderstanding you. You do not need to engage with every rumor, rivalry, or provocation. Sometimes, the most powerful response is consistency over time. Truth lived daily needs no defense. There is also an important distinction Stoicism makes between compassion and participation. You can understand why someone resents you without absorbing their resentment. You can recognize another person's pain without making it your responsibility to heal it. This balance protects your humanity without sacrificing your stability. The Stoic path does not promise that people will stop disliking you. In fact, it often guarantees the opposite. A person who is calm, self-directed, and unconcerned with approval can unsettle those who depend on external validation. Your composure may irritate them, Your independence may expose their dependence. That discomfort can manifest as hostility. This is not a failure of character. It is evidence of it. The deeper practice is to remain unchanged by that hostility, not reactive, not defensive, not withdrawn, simply steady. Seneca warned that no man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity, because he is never permitted to prove himself. Social adversity, including dislike and resentment, is part of that proving ground. When faced with judgment, ask yourself only what matters. Did I act with reason, fairness, and integrity? If the answer is yes, then you have already succeeded, regardless of how others feel. If the answer is no, then correction is required, but not self-condemnation. Improvement, not rumination. Another Stoic insight worth carrying forward is this: most people are too busy struggling with their own fears to truly see you. The version of you they dislike is often a projection shaped by their experiences, expectations, and wounds. Understanding this dissolves the illusion that universal approval is either possible or necessary. The greatest danger is not being disliked. It is allowing that dislike to distort who you become. When you start performing to avoid resentment, you lose alignment. When you shrink to stay palatable, you abandon your nature. When you fight endlessly to be understood, you exhaust yourself. Stoicism teaches that peace comes not from winning social battles, but from refusing to fight battles that cannot be won. As you move forward, let this be your quiet commitment. Live in such a way that your conscience is clear, even when your reputation is questioned. Cultivate character over image. Choose steadiness over popularity. Choose truth over comfort. These choices will not always make you liked, but they will make you free. In the end, the Stoic does not ask, "Why do they dislike me?" He asks, "Am I living according to what is right?" One question drains your power, the other restores it. And that is the final freedom Stoicism offers. Not the freedom to be admired, but the freedom to be unshaken. Not the freedom from judgment, but the freedom from needing it to be different. When you achieve that, other people's resentment becomes background noise. You hear it, but it no longer directs you. That is where peace lives. That is where strength settles. And that is where your life, finally, belongs to you.